Welcome back to Vaulted Egypt, and if this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found us. Thank you for spending your time here tonight. Before we begin, there are names carved into the walls of Ramesses II's temples that Egyptologists still struggle to explain. Some of those names belong to women who should not have been there. If you knew the title carved beside their names, would that change how you see one of history's most celebrated rulers? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Now let's begin. There is a name carved into the stone at Abu Simbel that does not belong where it was placed. It is not a small inscription. It is not a footnote scratched into a forgotten corner of a crumbling wall. It sits inside one of the most deliberate, most engineered, most elaborately constructed temple complexes in the ancient world. A monument built by a man who wanted to be remembered exactly as he chose to be remembered. And yet, despite every precaution, despite the lifetime of image crafting and stone carving and record rewriting that surrounded this man's reign, that name endures, carved deep, unmoved by millennia. The title beside it, Great Royal Wife, pressed into the limestone with the same certainty as any other inscription in those halls. The name belongs to a daughter, not a queen from a foreign land, not a noblewoman elevated by political necessity. A daughter, born of his own blood, raised inside his own household, listed in his own genealogical records as his child, and then, at some point that the written record does not cleanly or comfortably explain, elevated to the highest ceremonial position a woman could hold in the entire kingdom of ancient Egypt. This is not legend. This is not mythology borrowed from later centuries, or speculation invented by modern scholars looking for scandal in the dust. The inscriptions exist, the titles exist, the names exist. What does not exist, what has never been found, what may have been deliberately withheld or quietly erased is a complete explanation for why they are there. That absence is where the story begins. To understand what was recorded, and more importantly what was not, it is necessary to first understand the world that produced Ramesses II, not the myth of him. Not the colossus carved in stone, not the pharaoh of popular imagination who stood at Kadesh and bent the arc of history by sheer force of will. The actual architecture of power that surrounded him from the moment of his birth, in what historians now place at approximately 1203 BC, during the early reign of his father, Seti-i Egypt in that era was a civilization that had already endured for nearly 2,000 years. The Old Kingdom had risen and collapsed. The Middle Kingdom had risen and collapsed. The New Kingdom, the era into which Ramesses was born, was itself already centuries deep, a world shaped by the trauma of the Hyksos invasion, by the spiritual upheaval of Akhenaten's heresy, and by the slow, careful reassertion of Amun's priesthood that followed. The people of that time were not primitive. They were not simple. They operated within a system of extraordinary complexity. Bureaucratic, religious, agricultural, military, and at the center of that system sat the pharaoh. Not merely as a ruler, but as a theological proposition. The pharaoh was not a man who held power. The pharaoh was power made flesh. The pharaoh was the intermediary between the world of the living and the world of the gods. And everything, every ritual, every marriage, every title, every carved inscription, existed within that theological framework. This is essential context. Because when the records surrounding Ramesses II become strange, when the titles become uncomfortable, and the names become difficult to explain, that strangeness does not exist in a vacuum. It exists inside a system where the rules of the divine and the rules of the human were never fully separate, and where the justification for almost anything could, in theory, be found somewhere inside the vast architecture of Egyptian religious thought. Ramesses was not born the heir. His older brother, a figure named Nebet, was the original crown prince, but he died young, and Ramesses was elevated. From early childhood, he was groomed not merely for kingship, but for the specific kind of kingship that Egypt demanded: absolute, eternal, and inseparable from the divine order of the cosmos. He accompanied his father on military campaigns before he was 10 years old. He was given the title of commander before he was a teenager. He was named co-regent while Seti I was still alive, an arrangement that allowed him to govern in practice before he governed in name. And when Seti I died, in approximately 1279 BC, Ramesses stepped into the most powerful position in the ancient world at around 24 years of age, young enough to reshape everything, old enough to understand exactly what reshaping meant. The decades that followed were unlike anything the kingdom had seen in generations. The military campaigns are the part of his story that most histories lead, with the campaign against the Hittites, the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BC, the famous peace treaty that followed over a decade later in 1259 BC. These are real. These are documented and cross-referenced from both Egyptian and Hittite sources, carved into temple walls and pressed into clay tablets found in what is now northern Syria. Ramesses fought, survived, and then, in what may be one of the most sophisticated acts of public self-construction in the ancient world, transformed what was, by most military analysis, an inconclusive engagement into a personal legend of divine triumph. He had it carved everywhere. He had it written in every major format available to his civilization. He had it composed as a literary epic, the poem of Pentar, and recited and copied across the kingdom for generations. He understood narrative. He understood that the story of power, told loudly enough and carved deeply enough, could become indistinguishable from the reality of power. He understood that the version of events that survived in stone was the version that would define everything that came after. And he used that understanding with a consistency and a thoroughness that borders on the obsessive, decorating every available surface of every major monument he commissioned with his own image, his own name, his own account of his own greatness. That understanding matters enormously when approaching what the records say and do not say about his household. By the most conservative scholarly estimates, Ramesses II had somewhere between 200 and 250 wives over the course of his reign. The number is staggering not merely for its scale, but for what it implies about the administrative, logistical, and political structures required to maintain it. These were not all women in a single household in a single city. They were distributed across Egypt, across vassal territories, across diplomatic arrangements, stretching from Libya to the Levant to the deep interior of Nubia. Some were primary queens. Some were secondary wives who held a recognized but lower status within the hierarchy of the household. Some were the daughters of foreign rulers, absorbed into the domestic framework of the Egyptian court as living seals on diplomatic agreements. Some were Egyptian noblewomen whose families sought proximity to power through the gift of a daughter. And some, the ones that matter most to this particular history, were born inside that household itself. The number of children he fathered is generally placed at over 100. Some scholarly estimates go considerably higher. The daughters alone numbered in the dozens. At minimum, their births spread across decades of a reign so long that children born early in it would themselves have aged into grandparents before it ended. They were raised in the royal harem complex known as Merwer, a large administrative facility located near what is today called Medinet El Ghurab in the Fayoum region of Egypt. It would be a mistake to understand Merwer through the lens of later conceptions of a harem. It was not a prison. It was not a space of confinement in the simple sense. It was a functioning administrative and residential complex, a place where the women and children of the royal household were educated, housed, and managed according to their station. It had workshops producing luxury textiles. It had administrative offices. It had its own internal hierarchy. And it had, at its perimeter, the invisible but absolute boundary of the pharaoh's authority. The women inside Merwer were not free agents in the modern sense. Their futures were managed. Their marriages to foreign rulers, to Egyptian officials, to men who could be relied upon to carry royal blood outward into the kingdom in useful directions were arranged by the state. Their lives, from birth to death, were organized around the needs of the dynasty. Most of those daughters moved outward, as the system intended. They married, they established households of their own. They bore children who carried the bloodline into new branches, new alliances, new administrative arrangements. That was the design. That was what a household of that size was for. But some of them did not move outward. The name Bintanath appears in the historical record in a context that has troubled scholars for well over a century. She was the eldest daughter of Ramesses II by his great royal wife, Isetnofret, a woman who held one of the two primary positions in the household alongside Nefertari, and whose sons included the princes Ramesses, Kamweset, and Merempta. Bintanath's existence is not in question. She appears in multiple inscriptions across multiple sites, her lineage clearly established, her status within the royal family unambiguous. She accompanied her father on his Nubian campaign at a young age, her presence recorded in inscriptions at Beit el-Wali, and she is depicted in formal artistic programs alongside other members of the royal family at several major monuments, including Abu Simbel itself. What is not unambiguous is the title that appears beside her name in certain inscriptions, including at Abu Simbel and in her own tomb in the Valley of the Queens, designated QV 71 in modern archaeological cataloging Great Royal Wife. In the administrative and theological language of ancient Egypt, this was not a title given lightly or carried loosely. It was not a courtesy designation, not a ceremonial holdover with no practical weight. The Great Royal Wife stood at the apex of the female hierarchy of the kingdom. She participated in religious rituals alongside the pharaoh in capacities that no other woman could occupy. She appeared in the official artistic program beside him, depicted in the same scale of visual language in ancient Egyptian representation, where size communicated importance with mathematical precision, where figures were drawn larger or smaller in direct proportion to their position within the cosmic order. She was named in correspondence with foreign courts. She had her own administrative staff, her own household resources, her own designated ritual functions. She was, in every sense that mattered to that civilization, the primary female counterpart to the pharaoh's divine role in the world. Bintanath held that title, her father's title, the title that had belonged to her mother. The most commonly offered scholarly explanation, and it is worth stating clearly that a range of interpretations exist and continue to be debated, is that this was a ceremonial elevation, a ritualized acknowledgement of status performed after the death of Isetnofret removed the previous holder of the position. Under this reading, the designation of Great Royal Wife for Bintanath was a theological necessity rather than a personal or marital one. The pharaoh's divine role required a female counterpart in order to be ritually complete, and in the absence of another suitable candidate at a particular moment in the reign, a daughter was elevated to fulfill that cosmic function. The parallels with Egyptian divine mythology are noted. Within the theological canon, certain relationships between gods that would be considered transgressive by human standards were normalized, even celebrated, as expressions of divine power operating outside the constraints of ordinary existence. This interpretation is coherent. It is serious. It is the interpretation that the available evidence most comfortably supports, and any account of this history that does not acknowledge it as the mainstream scholarly position is not giving the evidence its full weight. But the explanation does not resolve everything. Because Bintanath's tomb in the Settevens Kam, Valley of the Queens, that space carved into the limestone on the west bank of the Nile, its painted walls depicting her passage through the stages of the afterlife in the formal idiom of New Kingdom funerary art, contains something that the ceremonial elevation theory does not easily account for. Inside the tomb, in a context that has been examined by multiple generations of Egyptologists, there is a depiction of a child shown in direct relationship to Bintanath. A child whose presence in this particular tomb, in this particular relationship to the tomb's central figure, strongly implies that Bintanath was a mother. The identity of that child's father is not stated in the surviving inscriptions. It is a silence inside the stone. A deliberate omission in a civilization where parentage was one of the most administratively and theologically important facts recorded in the entire archive of the kingdom, where the bloodline of a royal child was tracked and inscribed with the same care that was given to the construction of a temple or the measurement of a harvest, in a civilization that carved everything, that pressed the names of cattle owners into clay tablets, that recorded the exact quantities of grain moved through individual warehouses along the Nile, that inscribed the dimensions of quarried stone blocks directly on the blocks themselves so that their origin and destination could be verified. Silence in the record is not nothing. Silence is editorial. Silence is the shape of a decision that was made. It is the outline of something that was there and was chosen by someone with the authority to make that choice, not to remain visible. The second name is Meritamen. She was the daughter of Ramesses II by his most celebrated great royal wife, Nefertari, the woman whose tomb in the Valley of the Queens is, by any serious measure, one of the most beautifully preserved and visually extraordinary spaces that the ancient world left behind. Nefertari's status in the historical record is exceptional in ways that set her apart from almost every other royal woman of the New Kingdom period. She appears alongside Ramesses at Abu Simbel, depicted on the facade of the smaller of the two temples, carved there at a scale equal to the pharaoh himself, an honor extended to very few women in the entire span of Egyptian dynastic history, and one that speaks to a relationship between them that went beyond the merely political or ceremonially required. The paintings inside Nefertari's tomb, in the tomb designated QV66, cut into the limestone of the Valley of the Queens and decorated with a density and quality of imagery that archaeologists and art historians have spent generations studying, show a woman moving through the afterlife with a calm, a dignity that the ancient craftsmen who produced those images clearly understood to be of the highest order. The colors are extraordinary: turquoise and gold and deep ochre, and the specific blue that Egyptian artisans produced from a pigment called Egyptian blue, one of the earliest synthetic pigments ever manufactured, ground from a compound of copper and calcium and silica, and applied to these walls with a precision that 3,000 years of dry desert air preserved in near perfect condition. Nefertari is shown being welcomed by the gods. She is shown in the company of Osiris and Hathor and Thoth. She is shown as someone whose passage into the afterlife was not merely expected but anticipated, as if the divine world was waiting for her. Nefertari died sometime around 1255 BC, based on the best available dating of inscriptions and the internal evidence of the tomb construction and decoration program. The record becomes quieter around her absence, in a way that suggests the loss carried weight. The elaborate documentation of her life and status gives way to a gap in the official narrative, and then, in the years that follow, Meritamen begins to appear in contexts that were previously occupied by her mother. The title, Great Royal Wife, appears beside Meritamen's name in inscriptions at Akhmim, where a colossal statue of her was erected at the Temple of Min, a statue of considerable scale, depicting her in the formal conventions of divine queenship, her crown identifying her position within the cosmic hierarchy without ambiguity. She appears in artistic programs at other sites. She takes on, in the visual and written language of the official record, the function that Nefertari had held. The same explanatory framework that applies to Bintanath applies here, and the same questions follow. If the elevation was purely ceremonial, if it was a theological placeholder, a ritual necessity with no personal dimension, why do the inscriptions that document Meritamen's status not clarify that distinction? Egyptian records were not casual or imprecise. They were detailed and exact, calibrated over centuries of scribal tradition to communicate exactly what the priests and officials who commissioned them intended to communicate. The choice of title was not accidental. The accompanying iconographic program, the surrounding epithets, the spatial relationships in the carved reliefs, all of these operated as a language, and that language does not include a qualifier that says, this title is being used differently here. What it says, what it has said, for over 3,000 years, to everyone who has read it, is that this woman held the position of great royal wife. The position held by the first queen of Egypt. The position held by her mother. The position held, now, by the daughter of the man whose name appears beside hers in those inscriptions as her father. The third name is Nebettawy. She appears in the record during the later decades of Ramesses' reign, by which point he had already been pharaoh for 30, 40, perhaps closer to 50 years. Her mother is generally identified as Nefertari, though scholarly discussion around this attribution continues in some corners of the field. She, too, appears in inscriptions and artistic programs with the Great Royal Wife designation. She, too, occupies a position in the official visual record that parallels the role her mother held. Her presence at Abu Simbel, where she is depicted alongside Ramesses in one of the subsidiary registers of the monument's decorative program, places her in the company of the other women who bore this title during his reign. By the time Nebettawy's name begins appearing in these elevated contexts, something else was happening in the household that is worth pausing to consider. Ramesses II was old. Not old in the way that most rulers of the ancient world grew old, who died young, who were replaced by sons who were themselves middle-aged by the time they inherited. Ramesses was old in the way that defied the expected rhythms of dynastic succession. He was 60 years on the throne, then 65. He would go on to rule for 67 years in total, dying at approximately 90 years of age, an almost incomprehensible span of time by the standards of any civilization, ancient or modern, in which political power was held by a single individual. He outlived 12 of his sons before his 13th, Meritamen, finally succeeded him. He outlived most of the officials and priests and military commanders who had known him as a young pharaoh. He outlived the diplomatic relationships he had built, the foreign rulers he had negotiated with, the generation of soldiers who had fought at Kadesh. He outlived the world that had made him, and the world that had grown up around him, and he kept going, kept building, kept carving, kept inscribing his name into every available surface, while the kingdom slowly adjusted to the reality of a pharaoh who simply did not die. And in that extended span of time, the household around him changed in ways that the conventional structures of dynastic marriage could not keep pace with. Wives died, primary queens died. The women who had held the highest positions in the household were gone, and the diplomatic and political arrangements that had originally produced them were decades in the past. The supply of suitable foreign princesses was not unlimited. The political landscape that had made those marriages possible and necessary was itself shifting. In the gaps left by those deaths, positions had to be filled ritually, ceremonially, practically. And the women who were closest to the pharaoh, closest in blood, closest in proximity, closest in the administrative geography of the court were his daughters. Whether what happened in those gaps was purely theological functions performed for the gods and for the cosmic order, with no personal dimension, no dimension that would have been recognized even within the Egyptian system as transgressing the boundaries of what was permissible, or whether it crossed into territory that the surviving records simply chose not to document, clearly, is a question that cannot be answered from the evidence that survives. What can be said is this: the women who filled those positions were his children. The title they carried was the highest title in the kingdom, and the tomb of one of them contains the image of a child whose father's name was never carved into the stone. There is a fourth element to this history, one that operates in a somewhat different register, less documented in the carved inscriptions and formal artistic programs of the Egyptian court, more present in the diplomatic correspondence and administrative records from the period surrounding and following the peace treaty of 1259 BC. That treaty, signed between Ramesses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III after over a decade of intermittent conflict following Kadesh, was sealed in the customary way, through a marriage. The Hittite king sent his eldest daughter to Egypt. Ramesses received her into his household. She was given an Egyptian name, Mathorn Eferer, and elevated to a position of significant status within the hierarchy of his wives. She appears in Egyptian inscriptions and artistic records from the period following her arrival. She is depicted in formal contexts, she is named, she is acknowledged, and then, at some point that the record does not precisely or completely document, She is simply no longer present in those records in the same way. The details of what happened to Mathorn Furrer when she died, under what circumstances, what the nature of her life inside the Egyptian court was after her arrival from a civilization thousands of kilometers to the north, where the customs and the gods and the entire texture of daily existence were different from everything she had known, are not recoverable from the evidence that survives. The record shows her arrival, the record shows her elevated status. The record becomes quieter around her absence, in the same way it becomes quieter around other absences in this reign. What followed her disappearance from the active record, however, is documented. The Hittite king sent a second daughter, another diplomatic marriage. Another Hittite princess absorbed into the household of the man who had outlived so many of the women who had entered it. The stories that accumulated around the margins of this history, the tales that circulated in the more speculative corners of popular Egyptology, in the retellings that followed the European fascination with ancient Egypt during the 19th century, in the darker corners of the oral tradition that grew up around the figure of a pharaoh whose reign was so long and whose household was so vast that it generated its own mythology, tend to focus on what happened to Mathor-Nefer in the space between her arrival in Egypt and whatever end found her. Some of those stories suggest things about the nature of that end and about the continuation of her ceremonial role after death that the historical record does not support, and that any serious account must acknowledge as invention rather than documentation. They are worth noting, not because they are true, but because they are a record of something of the fact that, even in the ancient world, something about this household struck people as requiring explanation. Something about the way Ramesses organized the women around him generated the kind of unease that produces legend. Something about the combination of his extraordinary longevity, the scale of his household, and the specific arrangements that filled the gaps left by the deaths of primary queens created a story that the culture around him could not simply absorb without comment. That instinct is not wrong. It is pointing at something real, even when the legends that grew from it are not real. The physical evidence that survives from this world is, in its own way, as eloquent as the written record. The temples that Ramesses built, and he built more temples than any other pharaoh in Egyptian history, a construction campaign of such scope that it reshaped the physical landscape of the Nile Valley from the delta to the deep interior of Nubia, are not merely religious structures. They are arguments. They are three-dimensional texts composed in stone and paint and gold, making a sustained case for a particular understanding of who Ramesses was and what his relationship to the divine order of the cosmos was. The building campaigns themselves deserve more attention than they typically receive in accounts of this reign that focus primarily on the military record or the domestic arrangements. The temples were not incidental to the story of Ramesses II. They were the story, the primary mechanism through which he shaped what his civilization believed about him, and through which he intended to shape what every subsequent civilization would believe about him. Stone lasts in ways that papyrus does not. Stone lasts in ways that memory does not. Stone lasts, under the right conditions, in ways that virtually nothing else produced by human hands does. And Ramesses understood this with a clarity that bordered on obsession. He built not to serve the gods, though the official language of every dedication inscription framed it that way. He built to last. He built to outlast not just his own reign, but the reigns of everyone who came after him, including the pharaohs who would eventually attempt to carve his name off certain monuments and replace it with their own. At Karnak, the additions and modifications he made to the existing temple complex extended and deepened a sacred architecture that had been accumulating for centuries. At Luxor, his additions to the earlier Middle Kingdom structure included a massive pylon and a colonnade decorated with scenes of his military campaigns. The story of Kadesh, again, pressed into stone for another generation to see. At the Ramesseum, his mortuary temple on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes the scale of his ambition is visible in the ruins. The fallen colossus that once stood there was among the largest single sculptures ever created in the ancient world. At Abu Simbel, which was cut directly into the living rock of a Nubian cliff face in a feat of engineering that still commands respect from modern observers, the 4 colossal statues of Ramesses on the facade, each over 20 meters in height, are not images of a man who happened to be a god. They are images of a god who happened to take the form of a man. Inside these temples, the women who occupied the highest positions in his household appear in specific, carefully calibrated ways. They are present, they are named, they are depicted in formal registers alongside the pharaoh in scenes of ritual and religious significance. And they are depicted at a particular scale, smaller than Ramesses, always smaller than Ramesses. Their diminished size in the visual field a precise statement about the relationship between their significance and his. They are elevated above ordinary humanity. They are not elevated to his level. Between the legs of the colossal statues at Abu Simbel, carved at a fraction of the height of the enormous figures above them, stand the smaller forms of women and children, his mother Tuya, his wife Nefertari, his daughters. They occupy the space between the God King's vast body and the earth he stands on, simultaneously honored by their proximity to him and diminished by the scale that places them there. The visual language is exact. It was not accidental. Every element of these programs was designed and approved and executed with a precision that the surviving records of the craftsmen and administrators involved make clear. Nothing was arbitrary. The size of a figure was a statement. The position of a figure was a statement. The title carved beside a figure's name was a statement, and the title carved beside the names of his daughters in inscription programs at some of the most significant monuments in the kingdom was Great Royal Wife. It is worth pausing here to consider what the scribal class of ancient Egypt, the men who were trained from childhood to manage the written record of the kingdom, who learned the hundreds of hieroglyphic signs and their combinations, who administered the papyrus archives and the stone inscriptions with a professional precision that was itself a form of power, would have understood about what they were documenting. These were not naive functionaries. They operated within a system they had spent their lives studying, and they understood, at a level of detail that most of their contemporaries could not access, exactly what the titles they were inscribing meant and what the precedents for their use were. They knew which titles had appeared beside which names in which reigns. They knew when an inscription was conventional and when it was not. They knew, in other words, that what they were carving into the stone was unusual. The question of whether they knew more than that, whether they understood the full weight of what they were being asked to record, and whether they chose silence as a form of professional survival or as a genuine expression of institutional loyalty, is not answerable from the surviving record. But they knew. Whatever happened inside that household, the men who documented it were not unaware of what they were writing around. The harem complex at Mer, the administrative center where the royal women and children lived, has been partially excavated and studied by archaeologists working in the Fayum region over several decades. The physical evidence it has produced is fragmentary but significant: textile remnants, ceramic assemblages, administrative papyri, the structural remains of mud brick buildings that give some sense of the scale and organization of the complex at its operational peak. What it has not produced, and what no excavation anywhere in the Egyptian record has produced in satisfying completeness, is a full account of the internal lives of the women who lived there. Their names appear in external documents, in the titulary of the pharaoh, in diplomatic correspondence, in genealogical records that served administrative purposes. Their faces appear in formal artistic programs, stylized and idealized according to the visual conventions of a tradition that prioritized cosmic order over individual resemblance. Their births are sometimes recorded. Their deaths are sometimes recorded. The positions they held within the hierarchy of the household are sometimes recorded. Their experience of the years between those documented moments, the texture of the days, the nature of the relationships that shaped their existence, the degree to which they understood or shaped or were simply subject to the arrangements that the pharaoh and his administrative apparatus made around them that is almost entirely beyond recovery, it is the deeper silence that sits beneath the silence of the missing inscriptions and the unnamed children. It is the silence of voices that were never given the tools to leave a permanent record of their own perspective. The administrative apparatus of ancient Egypt, for all its extraordinary sophistication, was organized around the documentation of state functions, not the documentation of individual experience. And the people whose individual experience mattered least to that apparatus were the women who lived inside it. Ramesses II died in approximately 1213 BC, in the 67th year of his reign. His mummy, recovered in the Deir el-Bahari royal cache in 1881 by archaeologists working under the authority of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, and now housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, shows a body that endured an extraordinary length of time. Tall by ancient standards, a prominent jaw, a hooked nose, the physical evidence of a man who reached 90 years of age and was recognizably himself throughout. His hair, reddish in color and visible on his preserved remains, has attracted considerable attention from researchers studying him since his mummy was first examined in the modern era. His spine shows the curvature of age. His teeth show the wear of decades. He is, in the preserved flesh and bone of the mummy, recognizably a person, not the colossus carved in stone, not the divine abstraction of the temple programs, but a body that lived and aged and finally stopped. He was moved from his original tomb in the Valley of the Kings during the 21st dynasty, when the threat of tomb robbery prompted the priests responsible for the royal mummies to relocate them to the cache at Deir el-Bahari. There he lay, in a restored coffin, among the mummies of other New Kingdom pharaohs, for nearly 3,000 years. His tomb in the Valley of the Kings, designated KV7, was damaged significantly by ancient flooding and has been studied and partially cleared over many decades of archaeological work. The decoration programs that survive in its damaged state follow the conventional framework of the royal funerary tradition, the pharaoh's journey through the underworld, his encounter with the gods of judgment, his transformation into the eternal being that the entire apparatus of Egyptian burial practice was designed to secure. There is nothing in KV7 that directly addresses the questions raised by the inscriptions at Abu Simbel and the Valley of the Queens. The tomb, like the rest of the official record, maintains its composure. It presents the version of Ramesses that the official record always presents, the divinely ordained king, moving through the afterlife with the certainty of one whose place in the cosmic order was never in question. The daughters' tombs are a different matter, and not merely because of what is in them. The Valley of the Queens, the wadi on the west bank of the Nile, where the queens and princes and royal children of the New Kingdom were buried in tombs cut into the limestone, is itself a carefully organized space, a physical expression of the hierarchies of the court, translated into the geography of death. The tombs there are not equal. Their size, their depth, the complexity of their decoration programs, all of these communicate the status of the person buried inside. To be given a tomb in the Valley of the Queens, decorated at any significant level of quality, was to be acknowledged as part of the inner circle of the royal household. Bintanath's tomb, QV71, received that acknowledgement. It was cut and decorated and used. The wall paintings that survive, despite the damage that time and water infiltration and possibly ancient interference have done to them, show a woman whose status was understood to be significant. The funerary texts that accompany the imagery are those appropriate to a person of high standing, and somewhere in those painted walls, in a context that scholars have found difficult to explain through the framework of the ceremonial elevation theory alone, the figure of a child is depicted in relationship to her. Meritamen's tomb, QV68, has been examined as well. The inscription programs were studied and documented in the 19th century, and subsequent work has added to the understanding of its content and construction. Like Bintanath's tomb, it reflects the status of a woman who was recognized, at the time of her death and burial, as holding a position of significance within the household. The formal, iconographic programs of both tombs are consistent with the titles those women bore in life, and those titles, as has been established, were the highest titles that the Egyptian court conferred on women. Nebettawy's presence in the record is somewhat less concentrated than her sister's. She appears across multiple sites rather than in a single focused body of evidence, but the cumulative weight of those appearances tells the same story. A daughter of Ramesses II who came to occupy a position in the official life of the court that mirrored, in its formal documentation, the position of a primary queen. What none of these tombs contains, and this absence, is, in its own way, as significant as what they do contain is a document of accounting. A papyrus, an inscription, a marginal note on a limestone ostracon that says in plain administrative language, "This is why this title was used here." This is the specific circumstance that produced this specific designation. This is the explanation. Egyptian records contained exactly that kind of explanatory notation for other unusual administrative arrangements, grants of land made under unusual circumstances, appointments to positions that fell outside the conventional hierarchy, exceptions to standard ritual protocols. The bureaucratic instinct of the civilization was to document not just what had happened, but why. The absence of that documentation around the great royal wife designation for these daughters is itself a form of documentation. It records, in negative space, the fact that someone decided the explanation should not be written down. The scholars who have worked most seriously with this material over the past century and a half have generally been careful not to overstate what the evidence supports. The ceremonial elevation theory is taken seriously because it deserves to be taken seriously. The Egyptian theological framework was genuinely capable of containing arrangements that would be categorically different in meaning from what similar arrangements would mean in a different cultural context. The divine precedents were real. The theological logic was coherent. The possibility that the great royal wife title, as applied to these daughters, carried a meaning that was primarily ritual rather than personal, is not invented to make the evidence more comfortable. It is a genuine interpretation, grounded in genuine evidence, and yet the questions remain. They remain because the stone itself raises them. The unnamed child in Bintanath's tomb raises them. The completeness with which the surviving record fails to explain the elevation of daughter after daughter to this specific title raises them. The pattern of it, not one daughter, not an isolated case that could be attributed to a singular circumstance, but 3 daughters documented in this position across the span of a 67-year reign to raises them. Patterns are what the historical record is read for. Individual anomalies can be explained away. Patterns are harder to dismiss, and the pattern here is not subtle. It runs across decades. It runs across 3 separate names. It runs across multiple monument sites, multiple inscription programs, multiple artistic contexts, all of them official, all of them produced by the most sophisticated documentary culture the ancient world had yet generated. All of them saying the same thing about women who should, by every conventional precedent of the dynasty, have held a different title entirely. The Egyptologists who have worked most carefully with this material tend to speak in the measured language of academic caution. The evidence suggests, the record implies, it is possible that it cannot be ruled out. That caution is appropriate. It reflects genuine uncertainty about what the surviving evidence actually means. But the caution is also, in its own way, a reflection of the same instinct that produced the silence in the stone in the first place. The instinct to manage what is said about certain things, to choose language that acknowledges without naming, to hold a door slightly open rather than walking through it. The door has been slightly open for a very long time now. Inside the temples at Abu Simbel, in the innermost sanctuary, where the astronomical precision of the monument's orientation delivers the light of the rising sun twice a year to illuminate the statues of the gods and the deified Pharaoh who sits among them, there is a quality of stillness that visitors in the modern era still remark on. The rock walls are solid around the chamber, The painted reliefs on the walls are detailed and formal. The air in the deep interior is the same temperature it has been for 3,000 years, maintained by the thermal mass of the cliff face surrounding it. Nothing moves in there. Nothing has moved in there in any essential sense since the craftsmen who built it sealed the chambers and walked away into the desert sun. The women who are depicted in those chambers in the subsidiary registers of the wall programs, in the smaller scale images that accompany the large formal scenes of divine encounter, are there for a reason. Every figure in every Egyptian temple program was there for a reason. The choice of which women to include, in which positions, bearing which titles, was made by someone with the authority and the knowledge to make it correctly. The theological programs of these monuments were not casual. They were reviewed and approved at the highest levels. The images and inscriptions that appear in them are the version of reality that the most powerful man in the ancient world, with the full apparatus of his civilization behind him, chose to present. That version includes daughters who held the title of great royal wife. The silence around what that meant in human terms, in the daily lived reality of the court, in the specific texture of the relationships those titles documented or obscured, is not a silence that can be broken now. It is sealed into the stone, the same way the sanctuaries are sealed into the cliff face. The air inside it is the same air that was there when the last person who knew the full truth walked away from it into a world that no longer exists. 3,000 years of silence is a very specific kind of weight. It does not press down the way that noise presses. It accumulates in layers the way sand accumulates over a sealed doorway, covering it so gradually that no single grain marks the moment of concealment. And then one day, or one century, or one millennium later, the door is there, still closed, still sealed, and the sand is simply what surrounds it, and the question of what is on the other side is not answerable by any amount of excavation, because the people who knew the answer have been gone longer than most civilizations have existed. The child in Bintanath's tomb has no name carved beside it. The father of that child has no name carved anywhere in the surviving record in relation to it. The silence where those names should be is perhaps the most precise summary of what this history contains, not a scandal waiting to be confirmed, not a mystery waiting to be solved by some future discovery of a papyrus that will clarify everything, but a space where the full truth of something once existed, and where the people who built that civilization chose, with great care and considerable skill, not to let it remain visible. That space is still there, inside the limestone, inside the still air of a tomb carved into a cliff face on the west bank of the Nile, in a valley so quiet that the only sound it offers, on the nights when the wind is not moving, is the particular silence of things that have been waiting long enough to stop expecting to be found. The Valley of the Queens sits at the southern end of the great necropolis that lines the west bank of the Nile at ancient Thebes. The Egyptians called it Ta Set Neferu, the place of beauty, or in some translations, the place of the royal children. It is a natural wadi, a dry watercourse cut by ancient rains into the limestone plateau, its walls rising on three sides to create an enclosed space that the ancient Egyptians recognized as appropriate for burial. Sheltered, separated from the inhabited world by the barrier of the plateau itself, and positioned in the west, the direction of the setting sun, the direction of the land of the dead, the direction that Egyptian cosmology consistently associated with the passage from the living world into whatever followed it, the tombs cut into the valley walls are of varying depths and complexity. Some are simple, a single chamber, roughly cut, with minimal decoration. Others are elaborate, multi-chambered spaces with painted walls of significant artistic quality reach through corridors that descend into the limestone at carefully calculated angles. To enter one of these tombs, even in the modern era when they are lit and managed for visitors, is to experience a particular physical transition. The temperature drops immediately as you pass below the surface. The quality of the air changes. The sounds of the world above cease with a completeness that feels deliberate. The limestone walls close in around the descending corridor. The paintings, where they survive, emerge from the rock in colors that seem too vivid for something this old. The specific quality of pigments applied to stone in a dry, sealed space and then left undisturbed for 3 millennia, their chemistry unchanged, their colors preserved by the very absence of the air and light and moisture that destroy things in the outside world. In that environment, in that stillness, the images on the walls carry a weight that reproductions of them cannot convey. The figures painted there, the queens and princes, the gods and their attendants, the formal processional scenes, and the intimate ritual moments were not painted for an audience that was expected to see them. They were painted for the dead. They were painted as a functional environment for the person who would spend eternity inside this stone, surrounded by these images, accompanied by these texts. The ancient Egyptian understanding of the afterlife was not primarily about a destination. It was about a continuation, a managed, carefully equipped continuation of existence in a transformed state, provided for by the preparations made in life and sealed into the tomb at death. What was sealed into these daughters' tombs, along with the conventional furniture and equipment of an elite New Kingdom burial, the shaptis and the canopic arrangements, and the carefully chosen personal objects, was also the title. Great Royal Wife, carved into the stone, painted onto the walls, sent with them into whatever came after, the title that their father had given them for reasons the surviving record does not explain, accompanying them into eternity as a permanent fact of their identity in the world of the dead. Whatever that title meant in life, whatever the full weight of it was, whatever it described or obscured or documented about the reality of their existence inside that enormous and long-lived household, it is there, in the stone, permanent, not going anywhere, still being read, still generating the same careful, uncomfortable questions 3,000 years after the hands that carved it return to the same dust that everything in that valley eventually returns to. The stone remembers everything it was told not to say. It simply does not say it. If you find yourself drawn to histories like this, to the gaps and the silences and the names that were carved where they should not have been, consider subscribing. There are many more stories buried in these walls that have not yet been fully understood.